Welcome to tonight's slow history. Before the saints stood in stained glass stillness, before the incense burned behind gilded altars, before hymns echoed like fog across cathedrals, there was only silence, and a story still being written in blood and breath and ambition. The early church did not begin as glory, it began as contradiction, a desperate architecture of hope stacked upon fear, and within that fragile foundation there were already cracks, smooth ones, hidden ones, shaped by power and secrets, and the aching burden of holiness. They say the first stone was Peter the rock, upon which the church was built, but the truth is stones shift over time. They weather and splinter under pressure, they become foundations, or weapons, depending on who holds them. Peter, the fisherman, the flawed, the frightened, was named by Christ as the anchor, and from that anchor 1,000 robes would later bloom, each one stitched with sacred purpose and carefully hemmed in power. But in those first centuries, the papacy was not a throne. It was a question mark trembling beneath Roman scrutiny, and trembling even more beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The early church grew not only from miracles but from politics. It spread, not just in catacombs, but in courtrooms, not in revelation but in strategy. Bishops who prayed with their lips and bargained with their hands, men who shaped doctrine while fearing their own, of bone displayed behind glass, in chants sung over bread that trembled with metaphor, the dun, below backs in search of silence, men who dreamed of purity and woke soaked in sweat and shame. They were told their bodies were temples, but what temple cracks from within? What altar leaks in the night? Some wrote their failures in ink, others buried them beneath layers of psalms. But still the flesh throbbed, and the soul waited, and neither seemed to match the doctrine's risk. Each morning, among the mud and sickness and fever, the poor waited for food. Not metaphors for healing, not rituals. They prayed for rain, not redemption. They asked the saints for crops, and the saints in turn asked for obedience, and ignored those who merely wept it, canonized miracles, while overlooking the quiet revelations in every cell, in every sigh, in every sigh, in every mistake made in the name of longing bodies. Men who whispered of paradise, but often built prisons for those who loved the wrong way or bled at the wrong time. The body was a vessel, they said, but no one agreed what floated inside and what was meant to sink. But holiness did not grant clarity, it granted distance. The higher you climbed, the colder the air became, and still they climbed, believing that somewhere above the aching, somewhere behind the silence, was something sacred, something that would justify the endless waiting but never touches, who listens but never speaks, who asks for purity in a world of mud and memory. What happens when divinity is not a fire but a hunger, and that hunger points in every forbidden direction? Are human the ache of silence, not as peace but as weight, and within that silence echoes still the shape of a question not yet answered, just carved softly into the air, again and again, because they understood theology, but because something inside them needed. Something beyond reason, something that burned even when the world froze. Divinity was held aloft in polished gold in fragments. And then there were the women, the quiet ones, the cloistered ones, the daughters of nobility too inconvenient for marriage, or too vocal for court, Some were gifted to convents, as if holiness were a solution to scandal. Some were widowed too young, and told their grief was best offered to God. Others found that silence was not submission. It was simply a different kind of prayer, the kind that came with ink and margins and strange margins of the self. Among these women lived the first flickers of something stranger than obedience visions, written in shaky Latin, confessing not sin but dreams, eyes that saw angels with too many wings, mouths that whispered of being kissed by Christ, of being pierced with longing, so deep it turned into light. They starved themselves, not for beauty but for clarity. They bruised their knees on cold stone floors, and called the pain divine, not because they were masochists, but because it was the only language they had for the body's wild hunger for meaning. Holiness was expected to erase the human, but it never did. Under every veil was still a woman with blood and memory, and sometimes secrets scribbled in hidden books in shaky hands. Some confessions are still preserved fragments of parchment, speaking of desires too vague to name or too familiar to ignore. Was it the devil they feared, or their own yearning for touch? Was it temptation, or merely the echo of being made of flesh? Among the monks, too, there were tremors, men who fasted until their minds split into colors, men who lashed their. And while the church grew outward, gaining land and language and laws, it shrank inward to the heart of holiness, became a place of hiding the more. The world watched the more robes multiplied, each layer separating skin from sky, from scrutiny. The closer one came to sainthood, the more their name was shaved into a shape that fit inside the liturgical calendar, polished and clean and utterly unrecognizable. But beneath the altars and behind the closed doors, the questions whispered louder. What does it mean to be holy in a body that wants what it should not? What does it mean to serve a God who watches? In some cases it led to poetry, haunting delicate phrases carved into prayer books or hidden behind hymns, lines about longing and absence and ecstasy, lines that would later be misread as metaphors, but were in fact nothing less than confessions. In others it led to visions, entire nights spent in trance, the body stilled, the breath barely audible, and something else, something vast and shimmering just behind the eyes. Visions that told of divine kisses and celestial embraces that echoed too closely the language of carnal love. And still the church carried on adjusting its rules, explaining away the strangeness, collecting the relics, while ignoring the living pulse of those who left them behind it. Saints, those who suffered elegantly, because longing was the truth. Behind the halo, longing for answers, for safety, for transcendence, for touch, for a moment when the veil would lift and the soul would finally be understood, not judged, not punished, just seen. The early church was built on this duality, this aching suspension between the holy and the human. It asked people to transcend their nature, while never quite explaining how it glorified saints who denied their flesh while quietly fearing those who could not or would not. It created rituals to protect the sacred and accidentally built cages for the living. And still they came, the poor, the lonely, the grieving. They came with candles and calloused hands, with prayers half remembered and names long forgotten. They came not. That is the heart of the early church. Not triumph, not certainty, but ache, the ache of trying. to be divine in a world that never lets you forget you. From where and when are you watching tonight? He walks beneath the arches with the robe turned inside out, the slippers traded for sandals, the gold left behind in a box too tightly locked to remember the key he walks through. Roman streets that he rules and fears and dreams of the same way one unlaces a corset slowly, reluctantly, knowing what might spill out. If it comes to fast tonight, the Pope is not the Pope. Or maybe he is, but disguised in a way that lets him blend into the shadows between taverns and doorframes, between flickering torchlight and whispered laughter, the kind that stings with knowing and the kind that hides treason beneath a wink. The story is old and maybe untrue, or maybe it is truer than the facts allow. They say a pope once wandered the streets of Rome, not in procession, not in glory, not behind veils or under banners, but alone, clothed in plain cloth. When it echoes off wine bottles and half-closed shutters, when it returns, not as thunder, but as snickering, not as gospel, but as gossip. He heard that someone in the Trastevere district called him a devil in a dress. He heard, with teeth, one not afraid of blood, and the others nodded as if they too had forgotten that their leader was a man with eyes and ears and feet that walked past their doors, a street pigeons on his head, while his enemies carved marble epithets from his failures. He feared being remembered incorrectly or not at all. And perhaps most of all, he feared looking in the mirror and seeing not the shepherd, but the beast, not the servant, but the fraud, the mask worn so long it no longer came off, even in sleep. He left before they noticed the way his hand trembled. Before they saw the ring, he forgot to remove the one that glowed too bright, even in dim light, except on holy days when absolution was required even for him, especially for him, that a midwife said she saw horns beneath his mitre. He heard that the butcher's apprentice had carved his name into a slab of meat and offered it to dogs. Remember, waited for the city to forgive him for watching, waited for God to explain why silence always arrived before the answer. He heard, and he remembered, and he wrote the names down somewhere secret, somewhere safe. And one night, perhaps after a storm, perhaps after another failed confession, he looked into it and did not see a pope. He saw a man wearing papacy like a borrowed cloak, stained at the hem, heavy at the shoulders. A face shaped by stories, half written by others. He stared and waited for recognition, but found only a stranger who resembled an echo, who'd drawn low voice held still. He would pass by fountains that had forgotten Latin, pass by statues with noses rubbed smooth from longing and memory, and he would listen to the sound of sin, carried in tavern songs and brothel sighs and alleyway oaths, hoping to find the cracks in his own crown by peering through the city's windows, but understanding not betrayal but belonging, walking until the road no longer led back home, only forward into shadow, into rumour, into the tender ache of being human, while pretending to be holy in a city that never sleeps. They say it was John, but it could have been Boniface, or perhaps it was a dream passed from papal tongue to tongue, a cautionary tale whispered between goblets behind cathedral walls. Do not trust the people, do not believe in your own holiness. Do not forget that the throne you sit on is built on rumour and rotted wood, and the love of strangers, who will slit your throat before vespers if you raise taxes too high or breathe in the wrong direction. There was no safety, not even in the name of God, especially not in the name of God. And so he walked not nightly perhaps, but often enough that the dust on his hem told stories the guards never heard through narrow alleys past doorways, exhaling secrets past the places where sinners curled together in shadow and prayed to be unseen, where thieves argued over the shape of silver and mothers counted their coins like beads upon an invisible rosary. He listened not for worship but for betrayal, for names whispered too often, for plans murmured too boldly. He listened because paranoia is a form of prayer. The Pope is supposed to be the voice of God on earth. But what does that voice sound like when filtered through fear? Sometimes he slipped into brothels, not for pleasure, though even he was not immune to curiosity or the slow pull of heat in the body, but for testimony, for data, for confession. Without ritual he would sit in the corner and pretend to be asleep, while the women giggled over bishops who paid in pearls, or the friars who wept during climax, saying Ave Marias between breaths. He learned more there than in any council, more about the soul, more about hunger, more about the theatre of morality that masked itself as doctrine, and the way it unravelled after 2 drinks and a song. In taverns he became a shadow, leaned in too close to a group of masons, discussing politics over thick bread and vinegar wine, one said. Rome needed a new pope, one he did not fear death, or so he told himself. He feared becoming a statue placed too early in a niche above. They say one night it rained, and he did not return to the Vatican until dawn soaked through with the water of gutters and guards. Furious with the stench of the street on his skin, one of his cardinals asked where he had been, and he replied, I have been with the people, and they are hungry. But the hunger was not for bread or scripture, it was for truth, or something that pretended well enough to pass. He no longer knew the difference between mercy and control, between God's will and his own anxiety carved into commandment. This Pope was not a tyrant, though he could be cruel. He was not a saint, though he desperately wanted to be. He was not a ghost, though some nights he faded so fully into the alleyways that even his guards feared he would vanish altogether, only to return hours later with dirt on his knees and a new decree in his hands, something harsh and precise, as if penance had taken shape in ink. The city never spoke of him directly, but stories grew like moss, soft and slow and inevitable, that he once slept beneath a ruined aqueduct, listening to the dreams of rats, that he once kissed a beggar and forgot his own name, that he once stood in the center of a square and let the wind lift his hood, while no one recognized him, and for a moment he was free, utterly free from reverence and role and the burden of divinity that had been stitched too tightly around his ribs. In time, he aged more quickly than expected, his hair silvered not from grace, but from sleeplessness, from secrets held too long in the teeth, from prayers muttered too often without hope. He began to mistrust even his own reflection, covering mirrors with cloth, refusing to meet his own eyes. They found once in his personal book a note written in his own hand, not dated, not signed, just one line. The city watches back, and whether it was warning or wish no one could say, the Pope, who watched his people, began to wonder if they watched him in return, if the walls whispered, if the relics blinked, if the very marble under his throne retained the heat of conspiracy. And then one day he stopped walking, he locked the doors, he sat on the papal chair and held the arms tight, as if they might lift him from the floor, and he waited for someone to call him by his real name, the one he had before the crown, the one he could no longer. There was a mirror in his chamber, not large, but wide enough to hold his whole face. In the morning they found the mirror shattered and the robes folded neatly on the floor, and the Pope at his desk writing again, not scripture, not orders, just names, names of those he had seen in the night, names of women with laugh lines and men with broken hands, names of those who never knew he was there, and names of those who did but said nothing. He became quieter after that, more distant, perhaps wiser, or simply more tired, and the city changed slowly, as cities, forgetting pieces of him while reshaping others in legend. They remembered the Pope who wandered. They forgot why he began. They whispered he had gone mad. They prayed he had seen something divine. They never asked if he had merely been lonely. And so ends the story of the Pope who became his own ghost, wandering beneath arches built by empires greater than faith and older than fear, seeking not sin. They say the walls of the convent were thick enough to silence even God, that within the stone belly of the cloister time moved sideways, and the air grew heavy not with incense, but with waiting inside these ancient cells, dreams twisted into strange shapes and prayers, took on the weight, and that the absence of men meant the presence of God. But what they rarely said aloud was that temptation follows wherever skin breathes, and that the heart does not obey walls, no matter how high or holy. Of longing, the refused to name itself, the nuns moved like ghosts, in daylight and shadows at night, their footsteps careful as if afraid the earth itself might overhear the truth of their thoughts. To enter a convent was often not a choice, but an arrangement. A girl, too curious, too bright, too burdened with a scandal, might find herself whisked away behind iron gates, told that silence was salvation. They wore veils, not just to cover their hair, but to soften their identities, to become parts of a collective song of obedience and discipline. And when they walked the gardens, they did so with eyes lowered. The roses still bloomed brightly, as if daring them to remember their bodies and the taste of color and the hum of bees around petals that opened shamelessly in sunlight. Lust. But sometimes those sachets were filled with ingredients that stirred it instead. Mandrake root, belladonna petals collected during a blood moon, things that the church did not bless, but did not always notice in the hush of midnight. Another nun, a woman whose name remains on parchment, but whose breath has long since faded. Benedetta was seen by her sisters writhing in the night, her stigmata in whispers. Sister might vanish for an hour or a night, and return with her veil slightly askew her cheeks, because were spoken. Some nuns fell in love, not with men, but with each other, and their tenderness was written in glances shared over. Dreams they feared might betray them, reveal too much, call forth desires that no prayer could smother. One such rite involved tracing symbols on the soles of the feet in wine, mixed with ash before bed, a gesture said to lock the mind into holy sleep. But often it had the opposite effect, opening doorways into gardens that bloomed only in the imagination. Candles in fingers, brushing too long when passing a psalter, in small gestures that defied doctrine without ever speaking aloud their rebellion. Of incense, of holding hands with the Virgin Mary, of being kissed by Christ, and waking with a taste of honey in her mouth. The journal was found after her death and promptly burned by her successor, and the breath of a woman trying not to remember and failing when even the crucifix on the wall seemed to turn away. Not in judgment, but in weary complicity. They were not evil, these women. They were not wicked. They were simply alive in a world that punished them for it. But fragments remained tucked in the folds of her habit and remembered by those who had loved her. Despite the rules rewritten by men who could not conceive of divinity blooming in a woman outside the bounds of obedience. And yet they wrote them down anyway, perhaps half believing or half afraid, and wrapped in scripture. Does the soul quiet, or does it find other ways to speak in the bend of a wrist, the curve of a phrase, the breath held too long when someone passes too close? Touching these were not acts of rebellion, but of remembrance, a way to leave behind proof that they were more than roles, more than rituals, more than silent prayers on cold mornings, and their light, and whether you call it ecstasy or heresy, the truth lies somewhere between the two, in the space between vows and dreams, in the hush of midnight, where even saints dare to feel, too flushed to blame on prayer alone. If a pregnancy occurred, it was rarely acknowledged, the infant attributed to demonic interference, or more often the result of a sacred mystery best left unexamined, blooming not from quiet piety, but from something deeper, more desperate, and perhaps more human. Her superiors tried to explain it away as possession, but even demons blushed at the suggestion. One such nun was Sister Benedetta, and her story is one that refuses to be buried. She lived in 17th century Italy in the convent of Pescia, and her visions were not the soft, gentle kind favoured by bishops. They were vivid, raw, laced with fire and blood. She claimed to have married Christ in a dream, a union complete with a divine ring placed on her finger by the Saviour himself. She spoke in voices not her own, screamed of angels and devils, and collapsed in ecstasy before the altar. But it was not just her visions that drew the eye of the Church. It was the intimacy she shared with the nuns, prayed to keep dreams at bay, but some secretly whispered charms to invite them under their pillows. They tucked dried herbs sewn into sachets, meant to protect against. It was said that some convents had tunnels, not metaphorical ones, but real stone passages, leading out into the village or deeper into the forest. The existence of these escape routes was denied officially, but confirmed publicly. The nuns were chaste and obedient, but privately the heart had its own monastic rhythm, a gentle pulse that did not cease. Simply, when questioned, some confessed with trembling lips and eyes cast downward, not always from shame, but from memory. Others denied everything, and still others said nothing at all, choosing the safety of silence over the fire of confession. The punishments varied from isolation to exorcism to quiet transfers to other convents, where their sins were forgotten or merely repeated under different roofs. The convent was both sanctuary and prison, a place where the body was hidden so the soul could sing. But sometimes it was the soul that screamed and the body that listened in the long hours between vigils and vespers. Some sisters found solace in art, in embroidery that told secret stories, in music that carried forbidden harmonies, in letters burned before dawn, written in a hand that trembled with what could not be named. There were rituals, some forgotten, some invented by women desperate for agency in a world that denied them. Many performed small ceremonies to protect themselves against dreams. Inquisition records contain accounts that make the blood slow, accounts of sisters seen levitating during prayer or speaking in tongues, unfamiliar even to their confessors. These stories were often filtered through the lens of suspicion. There was one tale of a nun who claimed that an angel visited her nightly, not to preach but to touch, to press its mouth to hers, and leave. Her trembling in the name of sanctity, she was taken away, never seen again, her cell sealed with wax, and her name scratched from the book, but still spoken in cautionary tones by those who dared to remember. The line between ecstasy and heresy was always thin, thinner still, in the lives of women expected to embody virtue. While carrying the same flesh as Eve, the convents were meant to be above temptation. In truth, they were crucibles, where every suppressed longing burned hotter for being forbidden, and where salvation was sometimes confused with surrender. One abbess was said to have kept a journal not of sins but of dreams. In it she recorded visions of walking naked through clouds. The convent was a world unto itself, ruled by bells and liturgies, but pulsing with secrets. Beneath the surface there were sisters who never spoke, and sisters who laughed too loudly, and sisters who stared at the moon as if it might answer their unasked questions. The Church saw them as brides of Christ, but in truth they were wives to longing itself. There were nights when the silence was so complete it felt like drowning, when the only sound was the shift of linen against skin. The tales of Sister Benedetta are often dismissed as hysteria, or as the invention of men eager to make saints or sinners out of complicated women, but to read her testimony is to feel the heat of something unnameable. A hunger for connection outgrew the narrow cloister of her role. She was exiled, eventually stripped of title and veiled. Anonymity made to live as a reminder of what happens when devotion becomes desire. Yet her story survived, not as warning but as question. What does it mean to be holy in a body that aches? What becomes of love? When it is pressed into silence in the margins of old convent records, sometimes you find drawings, not sacred symbols, but small flowers, initials, entwined tiny sketches of birds or hands, and so the nunaries remain in memory. Dim corridors, echoing with footsteps that never fade, doors that creak in rhythm with hearts too full, too still. The night holds their whispers, their secrets, their longing. They say, marble remembers what mouths forget. In the Vatican gardens, where the wind once rustled olive trees, and the night air hung thick with incense and spilt wine, there are corners too quiet to be holy, and shadows that stretch longer than any prayer. We turn now not to stained glass saints or stone-eyed apostles, but to velvet and gilded sin, the kind stitched into the seams of history and sewn, shut by the silence of those who knew better, but of veiled assignations where frescoes depicted not the agony of saints but the anatomy of Venus. That the church must be resplendent to inspire, or so the gold stayed. The feasts continued, the lovers were hidden in plain sight, and the silence thickened, becoming its own form of complicity. Bishops turned blind eyes, cardinals turned over coins, and the faithful bowed their heads, never daring to ask why. Servant of servants lived like a king. There were priests who looked upon these spectacles and wept in private. Monks who scribbled warnings in margins, quiet confessions made in candlelight. They were events, invitations, extended, accepted, remembered. The sin was not the doing, but the silence. The collective decision to look away, to laugh, to pour more wine and let the incense veil the view. This silence, this hollow echo is what lingers long after the silk has decayed and the chestnuts have rotted. The tension between divine calling and human desire hummed beneath every organ note. It was the sound of guilt dancing with power. Not condemnation, but contemplation. For beneath the marble, beneath the gold, beneath the silken sin, there was still belief, still prayer, still longing for something greater. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all, that even in the height of decadence, the soul still whispered. Behind locked doors, the popes wrote poetry not to God but to lovers, composing verses laced with longing, while penning bulls that would shape the souls of millions to believe in a God of mercy, while serving men of appetite to preach humility while blessing. It is a paradox older than Rome itself, and still it blooms in our imagination like roses on a grave. We run our fingers along the marble worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, both holy and not. We pause before frescoes that once watched over acts too human for heaven. We remember the poetry written in the margins, the papal bulls signed with hands that trembled for reasons not recorded. There were mornings when the ink of papal decrees had barely dried from hands that only hours earlier had caressed silks more intimately than scripture, and still the rituals continued. The incense still burned. The robes were still donned. The mask of holiness never cracked, though everyone knew what lay beneath. What does it mean to rule the faithful while losing faith in oneself? Not ghosts in the usual sense, but something deeper. The weight of knowing. The heaviness of velvet, the taste of wine gone sour, and the quiet realization that holiness, when gilded too thickly, begins to resemble something else entirely. The answers lie not in scripture, but in shadow, in the echo of laughter that should not have been, and the silence that followed it. This is the tale not of one pope or one palace, but of a long stretch of evenings, where indulgence passed for piety and the word sacred learned to share a bed with the word spectacle, the corridors where laughter once echoed too richly to be holy. These are the scars left by indulgence, marks of a church that prayed with one hand and poured wine with the other, and within it all the people, the real people, those who paid indulgences to shorten their time in purgatory, those who knelt in hunger while the banquet tables groaned with roast fowl and honeyed figs. For them paradise was promised after death, while the clergy rehearsed it nightly. It is the late 15th century, and the church is not so much a house of God as it is a throne of gold, balancing precariously on a pile of coins and confessions. Artists were commissioned, not just for altarpieces, but for ceiling murals in bed. Musicians played madrigals, while chalices clinked. There was a rhythm to it all, a performance that dared not be interrupted. Those who tried were excommunicated, or forgotten, or worse, absorbed into the pageantry themselves. It is difficult to shout against opulence when silk is stitched over your mouth. The Borgia name slinks through the halls of papal power-trailing rumors, like perfume, the banquet of chestnuts, that scandalous evening whispered above, but rarely written in official ink, serves as the most vivid fever dream of this era. Accounts suggest it was held in the Apostolic Palace, hosted by Cesare Borgia, for his father the Pope, attended by 50 courtesans who picked chestnuts from candlelit floors, while clergy and nobles watched with the detached interest of men who had mistaken their power for divinity. Dancers turned to contests, clothing fell like petals, and the line between spiritual authority and carnal excess dissolved beneath the flicker of torch. Historians debate how much is true, but even rumor has roots, and the seed of this tale was planted in a garden already overgrown with indulgence. Pope Alexander VI born, Rodrigo Borgia, is the figurehead of this gilded age, a man who wore the triple crown with the same ease that he passed silver to his mistresses and titles to his illegitimate children. Lucrezia Cesare, names that echo not in scripture but in whispers and locked drawers. Nepotism was not a sin here, it was strategy, and bloodlines flowed more freely than holy water. Within the Vatican walls, opulence was not merely decoration, it was doctrine. To wander these papal pleasure palaces in memory is to pass through courtyards where fountains whispered not of baptism, they justified it all, of course. Theological acrobatics dressed sin in salvation. Was it not written that God rewarded his servants, that beauty was a reflection of the divine? But the stones remember, the soft worn steps leading to private gardens, the forgotten doors with locks too ornate for chastity. Even as reformers stirred, as whispers of heresy began to gain shape, the papal courts remained untouchable, cloaked in tradition and ceremony. And yet not all hearts within those halls beat in pleasure. Some nights even the velvet felt coarse, and the gold too cold. When we speak of the Borgia era, we are not merely recounting excess, but tracing the boundaries of belief and betrayal. The most haunting truth of all, perhaps, is that no one needed to hide it. The pleasure palaces were not secrets. The masked feasts were not mysteries. So we walk now through those gardens, again not as pilgrims, but as witnesses, and we ask ourselves, as the torchlight fades, what does it mean to serve the divine in silk sheets? The palaces remain, some in ruin, some in grandeur, but all haunted by memory. It is not judgment we bring to these stories, but attention. And somewhere in those frescoed halls behind a forgotten door, the servant of servants still turns in his sleep, dreaming of a feast. He cannot remember, and a silence he cannot escape. There is a hush that falls over the convent before dawn. The kind of hush that does not come from sleep, but from waiting, from breath, held just below the ribcage, from hearts thudding in rhythm with distant bells that may or may not be tolling. Sister Caterina was already awake, though she had not truly slept for some time, and her eyes fixed on the corner of the ceiling, where a crack split the plaster like a vein. Her thoughts were not of scripture, but of firelight, and the shape her hands made when clasped in fervent prayer. The other nuns had seen the stains on her linens, and the trail she left down the corridor to the chapel, and they whispered and crossed themselves, and turned their eyes toward heaven, though they were never sure what they were hoping to see. There were rumors of stigmata, of divine favor, of a holy wound delivered from on high. But there were also darker whispers, ones not spoken aloud in daylight, but wondered what it meant when the blood flowed with such regularity, with such theatrical timing. Her lips moved, but made no sound, repeating words that felt older than Latin, older than faith, older than herself. The church depended on them in many ways for miracles, and signs were convenient tools for keeping the faithful devout. But visions had to align with doctrine, and women had to be kept within the bounds of usefulness. The Inquisitor recorded these with great care, choosing to present to his superiors and which to keep for himself. He called it spiritual marriage, a union of the soul with its Saviour. But there was something more, something cloying in the way he lingered on her descriptions. How his quill hesitated when she spoke of touch. He called her a vessel, a mouthpiece, a living icon. But there were nights when even he sat awake, unable to sleep, staring at the candlelit flame and wondering what he had created or uncovered. The line between truth and performance had blurred so completely, neither could say where one ended and the other began. He never laid a hand on her, but the air between them crackled with something unsaid, something real. They saw the bruises that did not come from flagellation, the hollowness in her eyes, the way she flinched at kindness. The priest in charge of their confession dismissed these as hysteria, the workings of exhausted minds, and yet he too began to see her in his sleep, always looking back at him, always silent. Maybe it was both, maybe it was neither, maybe she just learned to survive the only way a woman in her time and robes could, by becoming what they feared and desired in equal measure but in breath, like wind against stone, like cloth brushing against the pews, a whisper that says she was here and she is gone, and maybe she believed, or maybe she just learned to pretend. Her likeness was painted in chapels, her story told from pulpit, though never quite the way it happened. Her eyes look past the viewer, unfocused, as if seeing something distant or nothing at all. Her hands are raised, not in benediction, but in surrender or prayer or something between. The Inquisitor is not pictured. His absence is louder than his presence would have been. The Inquisitoress' name was etched into official records as her discoverer, her guide, her name whispered in prayer or in warning, depending on who spoke it. She became a lesson not in faith, but in obedience, in how a woman's voice could be lifted so high it shattered, then silenced. Before the echo faded, he was promoted, relocated, praised. He died quietly, years later, with no visions of his own. They prayed for her, or said they did, and some envied her, some feared her, some wanted to be her. If only for the attention, if only to be seen by someone, anyone, even if it meant being burned. Some say she disappeared, that one day she simply walked out of the convent, never to return. Others claim she died in silence, buried in an unmarked grave behind the chapel, her hands still wrapped in cloth. Some say she was seen years later in another city, eyes, wild voice, cracked, claiming visions once more, but no one listened by then. Church had moved on to newer miracles. Too much ecstasy, too much autonomy, and a saint could quickly become a heretic. The Inquisitor knew this. He had seen many before, Caterina, and would see many after. But there was something in her gaze that unsettled even him, a lucidity that felt like a mirror. She had begun to bleed again, not from injury, not from illness, but from the center of her palms and the arches of her feet and the tender skin. Beneath her ribs she was called blessed, holy touched, and mothers wept, and children reached out to touch the hem of her robe. Behind her the inquisitor walked silent and proud, holding a crucifix high, as if to say, "This is ours, this miracle belongs to Rome." But at night, when the crowd dispersed, she was locked in her cell, denied food, made to repeat her visions again and again, until they became more useful, more dramatic, more divine. She described a man crowned in light, his voice like thunder wrapped in silk, who touched her with hands that burned and soothed in equal measure. He whispered to her of love, not the kind found in Scripture, but the kind that moved beneath skin. They wondered if she was possessed or merely mad. Some accused her of vanity, of seeking fame, of craving the attention that sainthood brought. But Caterina never asked to be seen. She only spoke what she felt, or what she had learned to say, or what had been whispered to her in the long hours when no one else was listening. Was it faith or survival? Did she believe in her own sanctity? Or had she simply learned the lines of a role, written long before her birth and behind eyes, and that left her trembling with tears that tasted of salt and something older still? The inquisitor took notes carefully, his fingers ink-stained and slow, and when she faltered, he guided her, coaxed her, even fed her lines when her own words dried up. The church sent an inquisitor, not out of suspicion at first, but curiosity. He arrived without announcement, dressed in robes, the color of old bone, with a parchment tucked beneath his arm and a look in his eyes that made some of the sisters tremble more than others. He asked for Caterina by name, though no one had told him it, and when he first laid eyes on her, he smiled, not with kindness but recognition, as if he had been looking for her for a very long time. Her story began in dreams, she said, in visions sent to her during the hour of matins, when the world was most silent. It was not uncommon for women to claim visions in these centuries. He paraded her through villages, dressed in white veils and bare feet, her hands bandaged, her eyes cast downward. She spoke of Christ visiting her bed, of his fingers trailing along her cheek, of his breath against her neck. Others began to question. The inquisitor defended her fiercely, even as he shaped her narrative, rewrote her memories, adjusted her testimonies in the convent. The sisters watched. There were dreams, strange shared dreams, where multiple sisters woke with the same image in their minds of Caterina, floating above the altar, weeping blood of the inquisitor, kneeling at her feet, weeping too, though they did not know why. Eventually the church declared her sanctified, not canonized, but blessed enough to inspire devotion. Caterina's end was less clear, and yet her story lingered in the corners of memory, in the folds of nuns' veils and the margins of old manuscripts. No one truly knows what she believed, whether the visions were real or rehearsed, whether she felt the presence of something divine or simply the gaze of men who needed her to feel it. Her image remains in a single fresco, faded and cracked, painted on the wall of a forgotten chapel. And if you listen closely, if you stand in the chapel long enough in silence, you might hear a whisper, not in words. There are many ways to punish a man, but few are so baroque, so needlessly ceremonial, so grotesquely devout as putting his corpse on trial. It was January in Rome in the year 897, and the basilica stank of candles and rot. The marble was cold, the shadows long, and the hall heavy with the scent of incense, unable to mask the scent of the dead. This was not a trial meant to be forgotten. The Church had always known how to wield drama, but here it crossed into something stranger. This was no mere courtroom. This was a theatre of the absurd, draped in holy cloth. The robes hanging from the bones, the rings still on the dead finger, the tiara glinting atop a skull that no longer dreamed, with its own contradictions, its own need to control, its own fear of being questioned. How fragile it is, how desperate it becomes when threatened. A dead man became a threat only because memory lingered, only because he had once mattered. And so he had to be destroyed again and again until the living could breathe without hearing his name whispered through the walls. The cadaver synod was a mirror held to the institution, and in it the reflection was not holy. They saw the madness for what it was, or perhaps for what it had become. The rustle of robes, the creak of old wood, and maybe, just maybe, if the light is dim and the hour late, you'll feel something else. Not fear, exactly. Not quite sorrow. Just the weight of a history that never stopped watching itself. Within months, he was deposed himself, thrown into prison, and strung lad. The final joke. The last breath whispered through dust. And it reminds us that history is not just what happened. It's what we do to remember, and sometimes what we do to forget. Justice, if you can call it that, arrived not by decree but by the same brutal whims that had led to the trial in the first place. The cycle spun on. The corpse of Formosus, now gone, had outlasted his persecutor. It was petty, it was paranoid, and it was dripping with the fluids of decomposition, but you cannot erase what is already festered in the public mind, not just for the corruption of the medieval church, but for all systems built on image rather than substance. There's a kind of poetry in it, tragic certainly, surreal absolutely, but strangely honest, because the Church has always been both sanctuary and stage, pulpit and prison, and in this moment it could not decide which role to play, so it played both. For the theatre of punishment when reason fails, for the lengths we go to destroy not just the living but the memory of the dead. Because, in the end, that's what it was. A memory on trial, a fear turned into ritual, a body used one last time, not to bless, but to indict. You cannot unring the bell that tolls over a dead pope propped in mockery. The image survives, like mould on velvet, always there, just beneath the surface. Pope Stephen hoped to bury his predecessor's legacy, but what he unearthed instead was a deeper rot, one that no river could wash clean, and behind it all the system cracking beneath its own symbolic weight. This was the cadaver synod, and at the center of it sat a pope, not a living one. Formosus had previously been bishop of another region, a violation of canon rules. If one were feeling pedantic, his accusers dredged this up from the past, like his body itself. His enemies used this trial not to expose truth, but to cement narrative. They wanted to strip him of legitimacy retroactively, to erase him from history by putting him on record as a fraud. It didn't matter that he was dead. In fact, that made it easier. The dead don't argue. They don't weep. They don't interrupt with inconvenient facts. They just sit and rot and let the living tell whatever story they wish. Not anymore. Pope Formosus, dressed in his once white papal vestments, now yellowed with time, the 3 fingers of blessing on Formosa's right hand were severed as if to prevent him from ever offering benediction again. His robes were stripped, his body desecrated once more, and then discarded like refuse. The Tiber River became his second grave. But even the waters of Rome were not quiet. His corpse washed up again, bloated and resistant. Fishermen found him tangled in weeds, and the people whispered that perhaps he was not finished yet, and grave seepage had been exhumed, dragged from his tomb, dressed in holy robes, and propped upright on a throne. His skin hung in strips like old parchment. His eyes had long since gone. His mouth was sewn or sagging. But still the new pope expected him to answer. The man presiding over the trial was Pope Stephen VI, the living one, the one with a pulse and a crown, and a need for theatrical revenge. You might imagine the logic must have unravelled in his mind slowly. But what's more likely is that it came all at once, in a divine flash or a sleepless night layered with resentment. You see, Pope Formosus had enemies. They never buried him in peace. The politics of the Church were never clean and never sacred, not even then. Formosus had been accused of perjury, of ambition, of desecrating the sanctity of the papacy by accepting it, when he should not have, and in death he became the perfect scapegoat. He could not argue. He could not correct. He could not do anything but sit there slumped and dignified in the echo of his own downfall. The court was filled with bishops and clergy and attendants, sworn to pretend this was normal, that a rotting pope on trial was an appropriate response to ecclesiastical corruption. The charges were read aloud slowly, each word bouncing off stone. Pope Stephen paced before the corpse, his hands clenched into authority. He demanded explanations. He gestured grandly, and when Formosus failed to answer, as of course he would, a deacon stood in his place and responded for him, a hollow voice, offering denials on behalf of a man already disintegrating. One can only wonder what those present truly felt. Was it fear? Was it fascination? Was it simply obedience to spectacle? The Church was not new to symbolic gestures, but this one felt like a fever dream turned canon law. When the verdict was rendered unsurprisingly guilty, the punishment was immediate and brutal. This was more than a grotesque spectacle. This was the Church wrestling not with Formosus but with itself. Historians have puzzled over this event, not because of what it reveals about Formosus, but because of what it reveals about power. But Stephen's victory was short. The people of Rome were not blind. The Church would later attempt to erase the synod. Documents disappeared. Records the trial declared null and void. In a strange way, the cadaver synod stands as a metaphor. And yet even now there are those who wonder who Formosus really was, what truths he carried, what enemies he made. Whether this trial was madness or method, you can still walk through the Lateran Basilica today. You can still hear the echoes, if you listen closely enough. Footsteps over marble, voices in Latin. Even the dead are not safe from doctrine. That's the lesson. There are stories the Church never meant to keep, but somehow never managed to forget. They slip between the vellum of forgotten manuscripts and the folds of linen robes. They linger in the soft folds of confessional shadows and hover above the stillness of cloistered halls like dust refusing to settle. One of these stories begins, as many do, with a silence broken not by prayer but by pain. A cry that echoed through stone walls, not from divine revelation, but from flesh, tearing itself open, and in the stillness that followed, a convent was no longer alone. There was another voice, now, small, breathing, hungry. It was not unheard of, not common, but not impossible. The world was already filled with rumors of strange births, of women who swore their bellies rounded like the moon, not from sin, but from sanctity. In the hills beyond the cities, there were whispers of girls swollen with prophecy, of widows clutching miracle children in bloodless arms. The age of Mary had never really ended. It had simply taken new forms. And in this case, in the dark hush of a rural convent, where the nuns grew their own vegetables and read the Psalms in voices barely above a murmur, the miracle arrived in secret. The nun did not confess, at least not immediately. She held the child with a kind of stunned quiet, the way one might cradle a bird that had fallen from heaven. And the others, the sisters who had prayed beside her, eaten beside her, kissed her cheek during feasts and fasts alike, they stared, not with judgment at first, but with a kind of slow horror, not at her, not even at the child, but at the question they could not stop thinking. How? Because this was not a place where men entered, not officially, not ever. And so the miracle began to take shape, not as confession, but as necessity. An angel, she said, or perhaps not an angel exactly, a dream, a vision. She had fallen asleep beneath the crucifix and woken to warmth inside her belly. She had felt no sin, only light, only a fullness she could not name. And for months she had carried that light without speaking, hoping, fearing, waiting. Some believed her, not out of conviction, but out of fatigue. It was easier, perhaps, to imagine angels descending through stone ceilings than to imagine a priest's robes lifted behind the sacristy, or a guard paid in coin and silence, or a gardener with quiet hands and secrets beneath his nails. The miracle cost less than the scandal, and so it was called a miracle, at least for a little while. The Church had ways of dealing with miracles. It tested them, poked and prodded and wrapped them in parchment. It sent inquisitors, not always with fire, but sometimes with feathers, gentle voices asking quiet questions. How did you feel? What did you see? Could you repeat the moment? Were there lights? Was there pain? Was there love? And she answered as best she could. Her words were careful, shaped like prayers, but too human to be divine. She spoke of softness, of warmth, of a voice that called her name like it had always known it, of hands that left no bruises, of something that wasn't God but wasn't not God either. It wasn't enough, or it was too much. It's difficult to say. Her story shifted over time, not out of deceit but out of need. Memory bending under the weight of interrogation. At one point she said she had dreamed of Christ, his mouth on her skin like fire that didn't burn. Another time she said she saw nothing but stars, that the child had entered her like a breath. Once she said she thought it might have been the devil testing her faith. That last version was the one they liked best, because it made everything easier. The child was removed, not killed. The Church had learned by then that such actions created more noise than silence. The baby was sent to a monastery or a wet nurse, or perhaps simply disappeared into the folds of some bishop's household. The records don't say. The nun remained for a time. She was not excommunicated, not officially, but she was moved, shifted like furniture from one convent to another, each one quieter than the last, until finally she lived alone in a room no larger than a tomb, praying to a God she could no longer name without flinching. And yet the story did not end there. It lingered because others began to whisper. Other women, other nuns. Stories surfaced of secret births, of bellies hidden beneath folds of habit, of midwives summoned in the night under vows of silence, of babies declared stillborn without proof. And always, always there was the claim of angels. Sometimes it was Gabriel, sometimes Michael, sometimes a nameless warmth that smelled of myrrh and tasted like salt. The language was always the same, sacred, unprovable, convenient. Some believed these were cover stories, lies shaped to protect lovers. Others believed they were hallucinations, the product of too much fasting and too little sleep. Still, others said these women were touched by something divine, that the Virgin herself had chosen new vessels through which to remind the world of its original wound. But none of the explanations mattered as much as the silence that followed. Because each time a miracle baby cried in the stone womb of a convent, the world outside turned its head. Paintings appeared, not many, but a few. In the margins of manuscripts, in the corners of chapel frescoes, women cradling infants, not with Mary's beatific calm, but with a kind of stunned awe or terror. One showed a nun with her mouth open in a scream, the baby in her lap glowing like coal. Another showed a sister weeping over a cradle as angels turned their faces away. Art did not lie. It simply asked questions more boldly than speech ever could. There were debates in small circles, theological disputes written in ink that faded faster than answers. Could holiness impregnate? Could the Spirit manifest in flesh again? Were these women vessels or liars or something in between? The Church issued no formal position. It preferred ambiguity. Ambiguity kept the walls intact. So long as no one named the wound aloud, it could remain sacred. The nun who gave birth and called it a miracle vanished into legend. Not sainted, not damned, just quietly remembered in the way ruins are, with a mixture of sorrow and distance. Some say she went mad. Others say she lived to old age and never spoke of it again. There is a single note in a ledger from a convent 3 provinces away that mentions a woman who prayed too often and never took communion. No name, no date, just a line. She held something once. She let it go, but the idea never went away. It returned in whispers, in folk songs sung by girls scrubbing floors, in bedtime stories told by nuns to orphans with soft hair, in the drawings children made when no one was watching. Always a woman, always a baby, always a light just outside the frame. Somewhere between myth and memory, the story shifted again, not through new events, but through the slow reshaping that happens when silence is passed down like inheritance girls entering convents. Long after the original miracle had faded would hear the story in fragments, not from their confessors, but from the kitchens where bread rose slowly, or in the garden where hands dug soil soft as skin. They would whisper it like a superstition, like something half sin, half frail. There was once a sister who bore a child, they would say, not with shame, but with curiosity, sometimes even with awe, and in their retellings. The child changed, sometimes it had golden hair and eyes like candles, sometimes it spoke Latin from the cradle, sometimes it floated for a moment above the bed before vanishing entirely, each version more impossible than the last, but none more impossible than the truth. The elder nuns rarely corrected these tales. They stirred broth or scrubbed floors with eyes turned inward, and when asked directly they would say nothing, or offer a single sentence in a tone like fading parchment. Not everything is meant to be known, and that was that. But the younger sisters kept wondering, kept imagining the room where it had happened, the smell of blood and incense, the sound of the first cry breaking centuries of silence. They imagined the mother kneeling beside the crib, not knowing whether to kiss it or pray over it, not knowing whether it was hers or God's or no. Once at in some towns, the story bled outward into local law. The villagers told it differently, of course, less mystery, more morality. They said the nun had been seduced by a traveling priest, or a demon in disguise, or a ghost from the plague. Years, they said, the baby had a mark on its chest, a bruise in the shape of a cross or a hoof or a question. They said the church took it away because it had spoken forbidden words in the voice of a man long dead, because it had no shadow, because it laughed too soon, because it cried too late. The villagers did not agree on the details, but they agreed on the lesson: don't lie, too. God, don't pretend to be holier than flesh. Don't mistake your hunger for holiness. But inside the convents, the story softened instead of hardened. It became a mirror for things to come. Strange to name, when a sister felt her chest tighten at the sight of another's hands, or when she dreamed of warmth that had no source, they would remember the mother of the miracle, not as a warning, but as a companion, a proof that the boundary between body and spirit was not as clear as the bishops claimed. They did not seek her name, they did not need to. What mattered was the echo. What mattered was the possibility that sanctity could include longing, and that longing could birth something not entirely monstrous. One manuscript from a convent near the edge of the known world describes a ritual done in secret by some of the younger nuns. It is written in a hand, both delicate and erratic, as though the writer were trying to keep calm while her pulse raced. It speaks of a candle lit backward, a psalm recited in a mirror, a piece of cloth worn next to the skin that once belonged to a mother or a lover, or perhaps both. The ritual was not meant to summon angels, nor to seduce demons. It was meant to create space, to feel something in the quiet, to dream of warmth without punishment, to acknowledge desire without naming it sin. It was not sanctioned, it was not forbidden, it simply was like breath, like silence, like a heartbeat beneath wall. There are traces in artwork too, but not the kind that hang in gilded frames. The marginalia in psalters, drawn by bored novices, show strange scenes: nuns cradling stars, animals suckling infants, while veiled women look on with blank expressions, serpents curled into cradles, being kissed on the snout by women with gentle eyes. These drawings were dismissed for centuries as nonsense, as scribal whimsy, but they hold a pattern, a pulse. They return again and again to the same theme: motherhood inside the walls, birth where it should not be, life growing not from doctrine but from the dirt. Beneath the altar one tale tells of a sister who found a bundle beneath the steps of the chapel one morning, wrapped in her own torn veil. Inside was not a baby, but something almost like one, a doll perhaps, or a statue, or a vision. It was warm for a moment, then cold for days. She kept it hidden under her pillow, kissed its forehead before sleep, spoke to it in the voice she never used for others. She told no one, and after her death it was found beneath her mattress, still wrapped, still quiet, and the abbess, who discovered it, said nothing, only returned it to the crypt, and ordered no marker be placed over the grave, only a candle to burn each night, until it burned out on its own. These stories accumulate, not as doctrine, but as dust. They coat everything without ever being fully seen. They live in gestures, a glance held too long, a hand brushed against a shoulder during vespers, the way some nuns kneel, not toward the altar, but toward the light, slanting in from high windows, as if asking the sun itself for comfort, and the church lets it pass, mostly because to fight it would require naming it, and names have power. Once you name something, you owe it acknowledgement, and if they named the nun who gave birth, they would have to decide whether she was miracle or heresy, and neither answer serves them well there. were some who tried to write her out completely, to erase the line from the ledgers, to paint over her image in the convent. Murals to scrub the linens and burn the mattress and pretend the walls never echoed with the cries of a newborn, but the echo remained. Even silence has a shape, and in the places she had lived it lingered, like warmth in a pew long after the worshipper has gone. The absence of her was louder than any presence, and in time even the ones who had tried to forget began to wonder, had it really been a lie? Had she really sinned, or had something stranger happened, something without precedent or category, something that did not need to be judged to be real modern? Scholars have tried to trace her story. Some argue she was a real person, that her name was Clara or Lucia or Benedetta, that she lived in the 13th or 14th or maybe even the 17th century. They comb through archives looking for evidence, a baptism record with no parents listed, a convent census with a name crossed out, a bishop's letter hinting at unrest among the sisters, but the facts refuse to harden the story. Remains fluid, shifting each time it's told, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps she was never meant to be pinned down, to be defined. Perhaps her miracle was not the child or the birth, or even the survival, but the refusal to disappear, because she has not disappeared. Not really, even now, in films and novels and whispered conversations between women who feel too much and say too little, she returns. The image of the veiled figure cradling something she cannot explain, something she did not ask for, something that feels like love and shame and hunger and divinity. All at once she stands at the edge of belief, not pleading for acceptance, but offering a mirror and asking quietly, what would you have done if it had been you? So the convents endured their walls, repainted their pews, refinished their windows glowing with colored light. But in the corners, in the cracks, in the spaces between psalms, her presence hums, not demanding, not accusing, just present. And when the sisters sing, and the incense rises, and the candles flicker with breathless devotion, somewhere beneath it all is the sound of a heartbeat, soft, steady. The nun who gave birth and called it a miracle may have vanished in name, but she did not vanish in meaning. She became the question, the secret, the prayer. Without a mouth, she became the space between confession and communion, the moment before the amen, where something unspoken waits. And if you walk the convent halls at night, if you press your hand to the cold stone and wait long enough, you might feel it too. Not a miracle, not exactly, but something close, something that breathes, something that remembers. They weren't meant to be remembered, but they remembered themselves anyway, not in loud declarations or dramatic escapes, but in scratches on stone, in ink, between the lines, in whispers caught between the slats of a wooden floor. The convent walls were thick, but not thick enough to hold everything in, and what seeped out wasn't rebellion, not exactly. It was memory, personal and stubborn, and shaped like a woman who refused to vanish even in silence. You could walk those halls even now, if you found the right place, found the right monastery, with the right wing closed to the public, where the lime has peeled from the corners and the mortar has begun to crack, and if you let the light angle just so you'd see them, initials scratched just above the reach of a standing hand, prayers written backwards to confuse the eye of anyone who might report them, symbols half Christian, half something older, a spiral or a bird with 3 wings, or a flower that never grew in any known garden, all of them the same message in different forms. I was here, I was thinking, I was not empty. The nuns who carved them didn't need you to understand. They weren't writing for you, they were writing for the next girl, for the ones who would come after, who would press their fingers into those same grooves and know without being told that someone else had walked barefoot down the same corridor. Someone else had laid awake, listening to the midnight bell, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. In some places, the stone has been smoothed by habit, not by weather, a repeated touch, a thumb brushing over the same line. Every time the matins bell rang, every time the abbess walked past, every time the memory of a face, a smell, a sin threatened to rise again and undo months of silence, the hand would reach out and smooth the name again, as if erasing it, but really pressing it. Deeper one wall bears only one word, a name, maybe, or a secret, or a spell. It says loose, it's not clear when it was written or by whom, but someone traced it again and again, in a way that left a groove so deep you can catch it with your nail. Even now, and maybe it was a sister dreaming of light, or someone she left behind, or maybe it was just the name of a girl who died too young before the vows took hold, and her memory refused to rot sometimes. It wasn't walls, sometimes it was books. The hymnals were sacred, of course, but the margins were wide, and the ink was accessible, and if you flipped far enough, past the songs to the psalms, you'd find the fragments, lines of poetry, half in Latin, half in the dialect of whatever village the girl came from, a sketch of a window with the bars drawn open, a candle held in a hand with 6 fingers, a bird again. Always that bird with the mouth open in a scream no one ever heard. They weren't trying to escape, not all of them, not most of them. They were trying to stay whole, to find a way to keep themselves from being dissolved by ritual and fasting, and the long echo of bells that marked the hours and the turning seasons and the years. They didn't have candles enough to mark birthdays, or paper enough to write full diaries, but they had the walls, they had the hymnals, they had each other sometimes. Not often enough. There's one story told by a visiting monk who copied a passage from a prayer book, not for its scripture, but for what he found hidden beneath the pasted margin, a loose flap of parchment, where someone had scrawled a dream in delicate, looping hand. She dreamt she flew not on wings, but on breath, the convent falling away beneath her, and the stars blinking like teeth. She wrote, I saw the roof below me, and I knew I'd never come back, and I wept for it, not from sorrow, but from pity. And that was all, and the monk copied it into his own journal, and we know her dream not because she told the world, but because he did so. Nuns had hiding places, not for contraband, but for memory, under the floorboards, a ribbon tied in a strange, not a piece of ivory carved into a shape that no saint would claim, a lock of hair dyed red the way. No nun was allowed to keep her hair when the veil came down, and the scissors came out, and the flesh was folded into obedience. They kept these things not to rebel, but to remember who they had been, and in remembering who they were, Belver. Abbesses were not always cruel, but they were guardians, and some of them believed that forgetting was part of holiness, the cutting away of identity, the shaving of pride, the scrubbing of the soul, and for some perhaps it was a relief to be nothing more than a voice in the choir, a name in the registry, a pair of hands folding linen again and again. But not all, not always. There are rumors of rooms that weren't in the blueprints, little spaces tucked behind confessionals or under stairwells where sisters went to cry or sleep or simply breathe in silence. One account from a novice in the 1500s speaks of such a place, the mirror room, she called it, where no mirrors hung, but where you could see yourself anyway, not in glass, but in the stillness. She wrote, I went there only once. I saw no one, but I felt her hand in mine, and that was enough. And whether it was a ghost, or a memory, or simply the comfort of a shared longing, doesn't matter. The room remains unwritten, but believed. The Church did not destroy these marks. They simply painted over them, sanded them down, reissued the hymnals with tighter margins and stricter edits. But the women knew, the stone remembers what the paper forgets, and every time a new sister entered, she was shown, in silence, the places to look, the spot where if you held a candle just right, a flower bloomed in soot, a symbol passed hand to hand, like a relic, not holy in the church's sense, but sacred in its own because holiness wasn't always what they were after. Sometimes it was presence, sometimes it was resistance, and sometimes it was just a way to not go mad from the repetition of prayers, said with mouths that barely moved from the chill that seeped through the winter bricks, from the dreams that kept rising even when the sins had all been confessed. There's a hymn that lingers in some convents, still sung in plainchant, with no attribution, but if you listen closely, the last verse shifts. It is not in Latin, it is in longing, and the words, when translated roughly, say, I dream of walking where grass grows, I dream of names no one has spoken, and I carry them like stones in my skirt, and no one ever stops me, and they say, it's just a variation. A regional variant, but some believe it came from a girl who scratched her name once into the wood of her pew, and no one noticed until the wood darkened around it, and the letters glowed like embers. This was their rebellion, not with fire or fist, but with persistence, with the slow, stubborn presence of themselves inside a system designed to forget them. The walls may have been high, but they were porous, and every inch of them whispered, not in defiance, but in remembrance. The silence of the church was never empty. It was full of these echoes, and if you know how to listen, you can still hear them in the places where the paint peels, in the lines of the old books, in the faint scratch at the base of the cloister column, where someone knelt again and again to say her prayers, and left behind a mark, not of sin, but of self, because even here, even behind the veil, the human desire to be known never dies. It softens, maybe, it folds itself into shadows, but it writes its name where it can, and leaves a space for someone to find it later, not to rescue, but simply to recognize them. So the walls speak not in tongues, but in scratches and initials and forgotten dialects. The convent is not silent, it is singing, and the song is strange and cracked and beautiful. There were days when the smoke from the incense never fully cleared, and if you stood in the back of the cathedral long enough, you could almost convince yourself that God was watching through the haze, that the marble eyes of the saints were not made of stone, that the hush between each echo of the choir was a divine breath-holding, waiting, listening, but nothing ever spoke back. And so the church sang to itself louder and louder, gilding the silence with gold and robes and incense, hoping, perhaps, that if the noise became beautiful enough, the absence would not feel so complete. In the catacombs beneath Rome and the cloisters behind tall walls, there were whispers of stories never allowed to rise to the pulpit, children with empty eyes, sisters with bruises they could not explain, priests whose hands wandered in confessionals where the curtains did not close all the way and the candles were always kept just a little too dim for truth to be seen. The church knew, of course, it has always known, and so it moved the guilty from parish to parish, sent them from city to countryside, told them to pray, to atone, to vanish. One cardinal wrote in his private diary that he feared not damnation, but exposure, not judgment, but scandal, because what God forgave the newspapers would not, and so silence became sacred, not because it was holy, but because it was safer. The vaults filled with reports, the letters unread, the pleas filed and forgotten under dust and vellum, and the quiet weight of tradition. Convents, once thought to be sanctuaries, became cages where inconvenient women were kept, not for their salvation, but for the comfort of those outside, unwed mothers, locked behind thick doors, their bellies hidden beneath habits, their children adopted out or not born at all, and their voices were recorded only when they screamed too loud to be ignored, at which point they were given new names or no names, or buried in the margins of church records as another soul returned to God. Without detail, the hierarchy of heaven on earth was more concerned with the mirror than the map, concerned with how it looked rather than where it was going. And so, when two popes excommunicated each other, the faithful watched in confusion, as if the divine could be split by signature and seal, and in Avignon the seat of Peter was turned into a palace of intrigue, where wine flowed thicker than prayer, and secret alliances whispered through velvet halls, while in the streets the poor begged for bread, and the dead were piled without sacrament. Those who tried to speak were not all saints, and they were not all right, but they were loud, and they were punished. A bishop, who dared to suggest the poor deserved more than sermons, was reassigned to a region without roads. A nun who claimed visions of corruption was fed nothing but boiled roots and silence. A laywoman who taught girls to read was accused of heresy, not because she taught the wrong thing, but because she taught at all. And the Church does not tolerate voices that do not echo its own. There were trials, of course, internal investigations, committees of solemn men with serious eyes, and folders full of testimonies, but the outcome was almost always the same: a sigh, a prayer, a transfer, and the reminder that the institution must be preserved above all else, because the Church was not just a building, it was the body of Christ, and what is a bruise or two if the body still stands in some towns? The graveyards behind convent walls grew crowded with crosses that bore no names, women who had died in childbirth without ever being seen, pregnant girls who had refused the vows forced upon them, sisters who wandered into the woods and did not return, and behind every grave a story, and behind every story a silence that hung heavier than the stone that marked the earth. Above it, one priest in the 13th century wrote anonymously of his guilt, not for what he had done, but for what he had looked away from. He described the shaking hands of a boy left alone too long in the vestry, the weeping of a girl who was told her prayers were the reason she suffered, the sound of flesh slapped behind a confessional door, and how the bells always rang too loud, afterwards drowning out whatever remained. It is a strange thing to serve a God who says, "Be holy," while wearing the robes of a man who is not, and the dissonance breaks. Some slowly they lose their minds, not from sin, but from the twisting required to call sin virtue, and cruelty, discipline, and obedience, holiness, and the eyes of those who try to reconcile the contradiction often go dull, staring into the distance, where no redemption seems to live. There are paintings from the Baroque period where angels cry in corners, and if you look closely, their tears are not for the souls of men, but for the walls that trap them, the frescoes that surround them, the silence they are forced to keep. And in those churches the gold leaf peels just slightly at the corners, revealing not glory, but the grey plaster beneath. Folk tales tell of churches where the statues turned their faces away, where the saints covered their ears, where Christ on the cross closed his eyes, not from pain, but from shame. But these were only stories told by peasants who had seen too much and trusted too little. The Church never acknowledged them, never named the sins they hinted at, never responded to the prayers that begged for answers, and through it all, God, if present, said nothing. And the silence stretched long enough to become normal, the way a wound becomes part of the skin, the way a shadow becomes a room, and the faithful learned not to ask too many questions. They learned to genuflect and repeat the words and offer their tithes and look away when the doors closed behind weeping children. There were moments of resistance, but they were brief and scattered. Like sparks in a rainstorm, reformers and radicals and mystics who called out the rot, but the institution swallowed them to chewed their words until only doctrine remained, and kept moving forward as if no one had ever spoken, and the silence returned stronger. Each time harder to break. Convents were not just prisons, they were asylums for women too strange, too fierce, too inconvenient. They were warehouses for unwanted daughters, sanctuaries for ruined reputations, repositories for the holy and the broken alike, and in their libraries The books sat unread, and in their gardens the weeds grew over statues of Mary, who looked down with eyes carved to seem gentle, but who saw everything. The Church did not burn its secrets, it archived them, catalogued them, hid them in sealed rooms, and buried them beneath centuries of reverence and fear. And by the time someone asked where the children went, where the sisters were buried, where the money came from, the trail had gone cold, and the truth was wrapped in liturgy. Too ancient to unfold. Some say God wept, but no one ever saw it. Some say the heavens were watching, but the stars never blinked. Some say the silence was not absence, but patience without justice is just permission. And the sins piled up, not only in actions, but in omissions, in all the hands that did nothing, and all the mouths that stayed closed. Then still people believed, because what else was there? What comfort, except ritual? What meaning, except the story of suffering turned sacred? What hope, except that somewhere beyond the dome and the smoke and the velvet, there might still be a voice that had not gone quiet, a light that had not dimmed a touch, that had not turned to ash? But history remembers, even when we try not to, even when we dress it in vestments and call it holy, even when we bury it beneath stained glass and incense. It scratches at the underside of memory, it haunts the cracks in the marble. It breathes in the dust of libraries, and sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, it whispers what the Church could not say, that the silence was never sacred. It was chosen, that the forgetting was not divine. It was deliberate, that the sins were not rare, they were ritual, and that holiness built on silence is no holiness at all. So now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy, and the dark curls in around the corners of the room, let the breath come slowly, let the body soften, let the stories recede into shadow. They are heavy, and they do not all need to be carried tonight. Let the silence return, not because it is holy, but because remembering hurts, and forgetting has always been easier. Good night.